It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the 2014 Tralac Annual Conference. This happens to be the largest of the annual conferences we've hosted to date. And I believe this reflects a growing interest and debate on trade and broader regional integration issues in Eastern Southern Africa, but also on the African continent as a whole. We're very pleased to welcome to this conference representatives from the African Union Commission, the diplomatic community, and our donors who have very generously sponsored this event, representatives from regional secretariats, government departments, trade-related institutions, private sector organizations, civil society organizations, academics, and some postgraduate students. This broad stakeholder profile represents an increasingly complex trade and regional integration process that is unfolding in our part of the world. It's also reflecting the challenges of a 21st century economy and the challenges and opportunities that that brings. The theme for this year's conference, a 21st century integration agenda for Africa, is an attempt to provide a forum to address some of these issues that we hope will feed into our policy making, our strategy processes on the African continent. We're extremely pleased to welcome as our keynote speaker, Professor Thandika Makandawire. In our part of the world, he needs no introduction. He will set the scene with a very broad-ranging, a very rich review, assessment of what is happening in regional integration in Africa. But if we focus in some more detail on the content of the program that we have for today and tomorrow, some of the important issues that are emerging in this 21st century economic, political economy reality require new thinking about trade, industrial policy, about regional integration. It requires new thinking about traditional policy instruments. And what I'd like to do is very briefly share with you some thoughts about the use of policy instruments at national level, but also in the context of our regional integration agenda. The import tariff continues to be a very popular, almost iconic policy instrument. It almost appears as if this is seen as the silver bullet that can solve a range of different trade, industrial development, and associated problems. In the monitoring exercise that is ongoing at Tralac, we noted earlier in the year that South Africa's International Trade Administration Commission, ITAC, which also serves as the SACU, the Southern African Customs Union institution in this regard, was considering an application, a very detailed application for tariff review, and indeed a request for tariff increase on sugar. A number of stakeholders contributed to this application. One of them was of particular interest. It came from a small-scale sugar farmer on the east coast of South Africa, coast of KwaZulu-Natal, which is the sugar-growing area in South Africa. This small-scale farmer, Lee Hlubi, set out in a very articulate manner the problems encountered by this small-scale farming enterprise. The two issues that were highlighted in this application were, Firstly, the high cost and erratic supply of energy. And the second problem that was highlighted was wages, minimum wages, and the wage productivity nexus. And this small-scale farmer had attempted to address particularly the wage issue by cutting the number of hours of workers. Of course, those of you who specialize in agriculture would see this as a very high-risk strategy, because farming is not an enterprise where the production process can be switched off at 5 o'clock when the workers go home. At the end of the application, Lee makes a very poignant plea, and the plea is, please increase the import tariff. The question then is, very obviously, what can the import tariff do to the fundamental problems that have been outlined and that probably apply not only to the small-scale enterprise, but more broadly to this industry? The import tariff can keep import competition at bay and so reduce the competitive pressure in the domestic market. But it will not address what are essentially problems of infrastructure and a broader services agenda related in this case to energy services, or indeed to labor market issues. This is a really interesting example because in the 21st century, where production dynamics at firm level, competitiveness issues and challenges, production relations, the complex industrial configurations of global value chains, and the dynamics of trade investment relations, the fact that increasingly in an interconnected, interdependent global economy, the trade story is as much a story about investment and investment location decisions as production is fragmented across many processes in terms of geography too. This requires thinking beyond the use of this very popular trade policy instrument. It also reflects a growing concern and interest in industrial development issues. In the development literature years ago, these were referred to as the supply side issues, supply side constraints on the capacity to produce tradables competitively. This has been identified for a very long time as perhaps a very important constraint to which improvements in market access may do very little. But this discussion about industrial development related to the trade agenda, so this trade industrial policy nexus, which is becoming increasingly important, has also highlighted a growing focus on another trade policy, industrial policy instrument, if you like, the export tax. How the export tax has been used literally for centuries. Discussion and debate about the use of the export tax is very often currently found related to the industrial imperative of beneficiation or value addition to move up the value chain, to use our commodity resources to develop downstream industries. It's important that we keep in mind that this debate must also include, acknowledge, and analyze the important prerequisites for such downstream value addition or beneficiation. In many cases, when we take a look at the minerals complex, if you like, That first stage of downstream beneficiation or value addition is very often a highly capital-intensive and skill-intensive process. This is not where many jobs are created at low cost. And it means, therefore, that the discussion about beneficiation and value addition should not stop with a discussion around policy space issues and the use of the export tax, but it has to take a look at issues such as investment and investment governance. And it has to take a look at labor market issues, skill development, education, training, and related to that, in the face of skill shortages in our part of the world, issues around immigration, movement of people, movement of skills. These are issues that are defining the 21st century trade and industrial development agenda. Sticking for a minute to supply side issues and another trade policy instrument which is integral to the establishment of free trade areas that we are committed to as part of our regional integration strategy in Africa. Rules of origin. Rules of origin, their task, their role is to prevent trade deflection. But they're also very much a supply side issue, an issue which has enormous impact at the firm level, as entrepreneurs have to decide on the combination of inputs, the source of those inputs, to produce a product to be sold in a particular market, to assure that the origin determination permits access under preferences that have been negotiated. Rules of origin methodologies that still predominate reflect a very different kind of production configuration, industrial configuration, not the sophisticated and complex fragmentation of production we see in the 21st century. And therefore, rules which rely on complex formulae of value addition and a range of other methodologies may not be the most appropriate in the 21st century. But what is? And we are starting to see, in some recent free trade agreements, some innovative thinking around rules of origin issues. The examples at this stage may not necessarily be appropriate to an African context, but they give us some indication that innovation in this area is possible. A fairly recent agreement between the European Union, the EC, and Korea starts to look at very different rules of origin. Free trade agreement between New Zealand and China shows evidence of some new thinking as far as rules of origin are concerned. And in the case of the New Zealand-China FTA, the rule of origin pertaining to the pharmaceutical products that are covered in that agreement takes a look in terms of origin determination at the location of product testing. So where the products are tested will be the country of national origin. It's this kind of new thinking about a traditional and a very important policy instrument that we need in the 21st century. My final example about the imperative of thinking differently, about new thinking, innovative thinking in the 21st century relates to services. Now, there's incontrovertible evidence that services are playing an increasingly important role in all of our economies. We also know that services and services inputs, producer services, for example, are essential to industrial competitiveness. They're a trade facilitation issue, but they're in their own right a very important driver of innovation and competition in many other markets. So to understand fully the contribution of the services sectors, we need to understand the relationships and linkages at the national economy level as well as in a regional context. In our part of the world, we've been very reluctant to embrace a comprehensive services agenda. Sometimes can take up to a decade before we start negotiating a trade and services agenda in some regional economic communities. A lot can happen in a decade as far as many of these services sectors are concerned. I would like to propose that we think, as far as the services agenda is concerned, out of the box too. A lot of our discussion and debate about services and a services agenda for the region is still cast within the framework of the General Agreement on Trade and Services, the GATS framework, that GATS box. It's an extremely useful analytical construct, but it talks about trade and services in terms of modes of supply. Mode 1, 2, 3, and 4. There are not many private sector firms that classify their trade in such modes. Many analysts have pointed to the fact that if one takes a look at what has been the impact of the General Agreement on Trade and Services, the liberalization agenda at the WTO level, the World Trade Organization level, it's been a very useful transparency mechanism, putting on the table, for example, the domestic regulatory frameworks that exist in member states. But in terms of further liberalization of trade and services, it has perhaps not met expectations. But if we think about the services agenda, then perhaps we need a different entry point. Market access or the liberalization discussion tends to bring the shutters down. This is not a popular endeavor for policymakers, or in fact for other stakeholders. The fine print when it comes to the services agenda is really about regulation, about the domestic regulatory environments. They will determine whether, in fact, new suppliers can gain access to new market opportunities. But I would like to suggest that we have a significant opportunity in terms of the development of a services agenda. And that is in its relation to our infrastructure development agenda. Now, this is not news. We're hearing this discussion in many fora. But perhaps we should focus on this regulatory reform aspect of a services agenda related to key infrastructure services, such as transport. Because this links very coherently to important aspects of a trade facilitation agenda in our part of the world. This way, one takes away the risk of running into challenges associated with the liberalization agenda per se, but starts looking at interconnections between policy areas and aspects of our regional integration strategy. In short, I think we have opportunities in a number of our regional economic communities, but also at a Pan-African level. After all, The member states of the African Union are committed to establish a continental free trade area. Those negotiations have not yet begun. This means we do have an opportunity to turn our agenda into a 21st century strategy for regional integration and development. Before I hand over to the chair of our session, just some very brief comments about the program that will unfold in the next day and a half. After our keynote address by Professor Thandika Makandawira, we have a session on SADC. And the SADC agenda is not new to tralac conferences, but we've included it this year because we see another window of opportunity. The review of SADC's strategic integration plan, the Regional Indicative Strategic Development Plan, the RISDP, continues. It began in 2012 with an internal reflective review at the SADC Secretariat. That was followed by an independent external review. Member states have committed to an ongoing process, which is still underway. The RISDP is a strategy document. It is SADC's strategy for regional integration. And with any strategy, ongoing reflection, appraisal, and reshaping of the strategy is imperative. We have, therefore, an opportunity to change this strategy into a 21st century vision for regional integration. That will be followed by a session on rules-based governance for regional integration. This is a bit of a mantra at tralac, rules-based governance, but what does it really mean? For us, it means that member states which negotiate and enter into international agreements, international trade agreements, agreements on other issues, should take those obligations and commitments seriously. But rules-based governance goes further. It's not just about implementation, but also, very importantly, about the consequences of non-compliance and implementation. This is an area that needs a lot of work in our part of the world. This afternoon, we'll have a session presented by our chair this morning, Mr. George Lipimile, who also happens to be the chair of the tralac board. He's commissioner at the COMESA Competition Authority. And we've included competition policies on the agenda here because this arguably is one of the important issues that should be on a 21st century integration agenda. As market integration proceeds, the strategies of firms that are driving that integration process, market definitions blur across national, geopolitical, and jurisdictional boundaries. We need regional approaches to market governance, and competition policy is certainly a key feature of that governance framework. Tomorrow, we'll take a look at an area which has seen renewed interest and vigor very recently, the EPA negotiations, negotiations to conclude economic partnership agreements. As we speak, there's a lot of activity on these issues. Take a look at what the outcome is likely to be. The market access regulation expires in October this year. Will we be able to conclude meaningful economic partnership agreements in the near future? And our final session tomorrow is forward-looking. It reflects upon the experience of the tripartite free trade area, this ambitious very ambitious integration agenda in East and Southern Africa. And the lessons we can learn for the continental free trade area. This is our Pan-African integration agenda. What can we learn from the experience of the tripartite FTA? So without further ado, I'd like to conclude on one note. And that is that this annual conference, I'm very pleased to announce, will take place in the region next year. Tralac is a small regional organization. We happen to be based in Cape Town, but extremely important that we have a presence and engage regional debates where they're taking place. So we look forward to hearing suggestions and options for a regional location for next year. Thank you very much.